When Mississippi grandmothers stopped cooking, entire suppers disappeared with them. These were not written recipes or restaurant dishes. They were meals made from memory, habit, and survival, served night after night at kitchen tables across the state. Once those hands left the stove, no one preserved these suppers and no one replaced them. This video revisits 10 Mississippi suppers that once defined family evenings, hard seasons, and Sunday nights. Each dish tells a story of how people ate, how they lived, and how food held households together. These meals mattered because they fed families when money was tight and traditions were strong. If these suppers are forgotten, the stories behind them vanish as well. Stay with this video to see which meals Mississippi lost when grandmothers stopped cooking, and why remembering them still matters today. Before Mississippi kitchens had timers or printed cookbooks, hoe cake suppers filled the quiet space between hunger and comfort. Hoe cakes were simple cornmeal cakes cooked in hot fat, often in a cast iron skillet that never left the stove. They were not a side dish. They were the meal. When supper plans fell apart or money ran thin, hoe cakes showed up without warning and saved the evening. A hoe cake supper usually meant a stack of crisp cakes, a jar of molasses or syrup, and whatever else the kitchen could offer. Sometimes there were field peas. Sometimes a pot of greens with pot liquor. Sometimes nothing but butter and salt. The table did not look impressive, but everyone ate until they were full. Grandmothers learned hoe cakes from their mothers, who learned them from necessity. Cornmeal was cheap, shelf-stable, and always nearby. Cooking hoe cakes required no measuring cups, no written instructions, and no patience for perfection. You knew they were ready by sound and smell alone. These suppers mattered because they taught families how to survive lean days without complaint. Children learned that a warm meal did not need meat to feel complete. Adults learned how to stretch a pantry without shame. The ritual itself became comforting, even when circumstances were not. When grandmothers stopped cooking, hoe cake suppers faded first. Younger generations treated them as snacks or breakfast food, not as a full meal worth sitting down for. Without the memory of hard times, the meaning disappeared. Hoe cake suppers fed Mississippi families through poverty, storms, and long workdays. Losing them meant losing a lesson in resilience, humility, and quiet care. That is why remembering this supper matters, because it explains how simple food once carried families forward, night after night, without applause, attention, or recognition from anyone beyond the table at home. Tomato gravy and biscuits was a supper born from empty cupboards and practiced hands. In Mississippi kitchens, it appeared when meat was scarce but hunger was not. A pot of tomatoes, a little flour, and hot biscuits were enough to turn a thin pantry into a full table. It was not fancy, but it was dependable. The gravy started with canned tomatoes or summer jars put up months earlier. They simmered slowly with flour, grease, salt, and black pepper until thick and smooth. Biscuits baked while the gravy bubbled, filling the kitchen with a smell that promised relief. Supper was ready without ceremony, often poured straight over split biscuits. This meal mattered because it respected effort over ingredients. Grandmothers did not apologize for tomato gravy suppers. They understood that feeding people well did not always mean feeding them richly. Children learned that comfort came from familiarity, not abundance. Tomato gravy suppers also carried rhythm. They showed up after long workdays, rainy afternoons, or weeks when pay stretched too thin. Everyone knew what it meant when the pot came out. It meant the day was done and the family would eat together. When grandmothers stopped cooking, tomato gravy lost its place at the table. Younger cooks treated it as a sauce, not a supper. Restaurants ignored it because it could not be dressed up or priced high. Without memory, it faded quietly. This supper fed generations without asking for praise. Remembering tomato gravy and biscuits matters because it shows how Mississippi kitchens turned simplicity into stability, and how ordinary food once carried families through ordinary nights with patience, warmth, and care. Those quiet suppers shaped values, teaching gratitude, endurance, and togetherness, lessons passed hand to hand, plate to plate, until the stove went cold and the stories stopped in many homes. Field peas and fatback was a Mississippi supper that never pretended to be anything else. It was plain, filling, and rooted in seasons. When peas came in from the field, supper was decided before anyone spoke. A pot went on the stove, and the day slowed down. The peas simmered with fatback, onion, salt, and thyme. There was no rush. The broth grew rich while the peas softened, and the kitchen filled with a smell that meant home. Cornbread baked alongside, because it always did. Together, they made a full meal without needing anything more. This supper mattered because it followed the land. Families ate what grew nearby and what could be preserved. Field peas dried well and kept through winter. Fatback stretched flavor when meat was scarce. Grandmothers knew how to balance both without waste. Children learned patience from this meal. You waited for peas to finish. You dipped cornbread slowly. You listened while adults talked about weather, work, and tomorrow. Supper was not rushed, and neither were the lessons. When grandmothers stopped cooking, field peas lost their place. Bags from grocery stores replaced fresh harvests. Fatback disappeared from kitchens, labeled unhealthy and outdated. Without context, the meal seemed heavy and unnecessary. Field peas and fatback fed Mississippi families through heat, hardship, and change. Losing this supper meant losing a connection to land and time. Remembering it matters because it shows how food once followed nature, respected limits, and turned simple harvests into steady comfort at the end of long days. These suppers were quiet traditions, passed without instruction, remembered by taste alone. They taught restraint, gratitude, and rhythm. When they vanished, something essential went missing. Bringing them back to memory restores understanding of how ordinary food once carried dignity, balance, and care into everyday Mississippi life there today. Smothered pork chops and rice was a Mississippi supper built for long days and quiet evenings. It appeared after field work, mill shifts, or school days that left everyone tired and hungry. Thick gravy, slow cooking, and white rice turned tough cuts of meat into comfort that lasted until bedtime. The pork chops browned first, then settled into a pan of onions, flour, grease, and water. The lid went on and time did the rest. Rice steamed nearby, soaking up every drop of gravy. Supper came together quietly, without hurry or complaint. This meal mattered because it rewarded patience. Smothering made cheap meat tender. Rice stretched the pan so everyone ate well. Grandmothers understood how to feed families without excess, using skill instead of abundance. Smothered pork chop suppers also taught restraint. You waited for the gravy to thicken. You scooped carefully, making sure there was enough for everyone. Conversation slowed as plates filled. When grandmothers stopped cooking, this supper faded. It took too long. It asked for attention. Restaurants rushed it or sweetened it. Without time, the meaning disappeared. Smothered pork chops and rice fed Mississippi families through work and worry. Remembering this supper matters because it shows how care, patience, and quiet skill once turned ordinary ingredients into something steady and sustaining at the end of hard days. Those suppers were not rushed or photographed. They existed to restore strength and calm. Losing them meant losing the rhythm of evenings built around waiting, sharing, and listening. When the stove went cold, that rhythm went with it, leaving meals that filled stomachs but rarely carried the same patience, balance, and quiet dignity that once defined Mississippi tables after sunset. Remembering this supper brings back the values that fed families when little else could, night after night, together, at home. Chicken bog was a Mississippi supper meant to stretch one bird across an entire family. It was neither soup nor stew, but something heavier, built to fill plates and quiet hunger. When a chicken came into the kitchen, everyone knew supper would last for days. The chicken simmered slowly with salt, pepper, and onion until the meat softened and the broth deepened. Rice went in next, swelling and soaking up flavor. Nothing was drained. Nothing was wasted. What came out of the pot was thick, rich, and meant to be eaten with a spoon. This supper mattered because it respected limits. Chickens were valuable. Rice was cheap. Together they fed many mouths without complaint. Grandmothers knew how much rice to add without measuring. They watched the pot and listened to it. Chicken bog also carried patience. It could not be rushed. The rice told you when it was ready. Supper waited until it was right. When grandmothers stopped cooking, chicken bog disappeared. Grocery stores sold parts, not whole birds. Younger cooks skipped the broth and lost the balance. Restaurants never understood it. This supper fed Mississippi families through sickness, loss, and ordinary nights. Remembering chicken bog matters because it shows how care and restraint once shaped meals. It proves that feeding people well did not require excess, only attention, time, and knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. When the pot stopped simmering in home kitchens, chicken bog faded into memory. What vanished was not just a dish, but the skill of turning one simple chicken into comfort that carried families together through more than one long evening. It reminded people that survival food could still feel generous, steady, and human, even when resources were limited, work was hard, and tomorrow felt uncertain, but supper brought everyone back. Cornbread and buttermilk was a Mississippi supper that required almost nothing yet fed everyone completely. The cornmeal came from the pantry, the buttermilk from the churn or grocery jar, and the stove did the rest. No meat, no fancy ingredients, just simplicity, patience, and sustenance. The cornbread baked until golden, crisp at the edges, soft in the center. Butter melted into it while the buttermilk sat in a jar or cup nearby. Families ate in silence at first, letting the warmth of food fill empty stomachs. Then conversation began, slow and familiar, because supper was not only nourishment but routine. This supper mattered because it showed how Mississippi kitchens survived scarcity. Cornbread stretched meals, buttermilk added protein and comfort. Children learned that food could be humble and still satisfying. Adults learned that careful preparation and attention mattered more than extravagance. Cornbread and buttermilk also carried memory. Grandmothers made it on long, hot afternoons when work was done, or on cold nights when the fire crackled. It was predictable, reliable, and always ready. That reliability created quiet security. When grandmothers stopped cooking, this supper shifted from necessity to novelty. Younger generations treated it as breakfast or snack food. The ritual of pairing cornbread with buttermilk for an entire meal disappeared from tables. Without the memory of scarcity and patience, its meaning vanished. Remembering cornbread and buttermilk matters because it shows how Mississippi families once turned simple ingredients into comfort, rhythm, and tradition. This supper fed more than hunger. It fed resilience, taught gratitude, and carried generations through ordinary evenings. Losing it meant losing lessons on patience, resourcefulness, and care, values once woven into the rhythm of a Mississippi supper, quietly passed from grandmother to child, plate to plate, night after night. Fried green tomatoes with gravy was a Mississippi supper born from gardens and ingenuity. When tomatoes were not yet ripe, or when summer produced an excess, grandmothers turned firm, tart tomatoes into something warm and satisfying. The skillet sizzled, the kitchen smelled of browning butter and flour, and the table waited. Tomatoes were sliced, coated in seasoned cornmeal or flour, and fried until golden. The gravy, often made from pan drippings, milk, and a pinch of salt, was poured over the top. Sometimes, a side of rice or fresh cornbread accompanied the dish. It was not fancy, but it was filling and comforting. This supper mattered because it turned what others might discard into the centerpiece of the evening. Children learned resourcefulness, that food could be transformed with care and attention. Adults appreciated skill, that flavor came not from abundance, but from patience and timing. Fried green tomatoes with gravy also carried rhythm. It appeared in summer when tomatoes were firm, a dish tied to the seasons and to family traditions. Grandmothers knew exactly when the tomatoes were ready for frying and when the gravy had the perfect consistency. The meal taught observation, care, and respect for the ingredients. When grandmothers stopped cooking, this supper faded. Younger cooks often overlooked it, considering it a snack or appetizer rather than a full meal. Restaurants did not preserve it because it required skill and timing. Without those who remembered, the supper quietly vanished from tables. Remembering fried green tomatoes with gravy matters because it highlights how Mississippi kitchens created sustenance and satisfaction from modest ingredients. It was a lesson in creativity, patience, and tradition. Losing it meant losing not only a meal, but a connection to the seasons, the land, and the quiet ways families nourished themselves and one another, night after night. Leftover stew nights were a Mississippi supper born from necessity, thrift, and careful planning. When a Sunday pot of meat and vegetables ran low, nothing was wasted. Grandmothers transformed yesterday's supper into a new meal, simmering the remnants into a thick, flavorful stew that could feed the family again. The pot came out of the fridge or cellar, reheated slowly over the stove. Onions, a pinch of salt, and a little flour or cornmeal often joined the mix to thicken and enrich it. Rice, grits, or fresh cornbread might accompany the dish. Nothing extravagant was needed. Every ingredient served a purpose, and every bite was meaningful. This supper mattered because it taught families resourcefulness. Children learned that food could be remade, flavors deepened, and nothing wasted. Adults understood how care and attention extended meals, saved money, and nourished everyone at the table. Leftover stew nights were a quiet exercise in sustainability before anyone called it that. It also carried a rhythm. Families looked forward to seeing what yesterday had become. Conversations slowed as everyone ate, savoring the taste and the warmth. The meal reminded them that effort mattered more than abundance. When grandmothers stopped cooking, leftover stew nights disappeared. Convenience and prepackaged meals replaced them. Younger generations rarely saw value in transforming yesterday's food into tonight's supper. Restaurants never honored them because creativity from leftovers rarely sold. Remembering leftover stew nights matters because it reveals how Mississippi kitchens once balanced thrift, flavor, and care. It was a lesson in humility, patience, and continuity. Losing this supper meant losing the understanding that meals could teach, connect, and sustain families without extravagance, night after night, in kitchens where every pot and plate carried a story of survival, skill, and quiet love. Pot liquor meals were a Mississippi supper that emerged from necessity, patience, and tradition. When greens such as collards, turnip tops, or mustard greens were simmered, the water left behind, pot liquor, became a flavorful, nourishing broth. Grandmothers poured it over cornbread, rice, or sometimes fried potatoes, creating a simple but sustaining meal that fed entire families. The greens themselves were cooked slowly, often with pieces of salt pork or fatback, until tender. The broth absorbed every bit of flavor, thickening naturally and carrying the essence of the ingredients. Cornbread crumbled into it, soaking up richness and warmth. It was humble, but it left no one hungry. This supper mattered because it turned basic ingredients into something meaningful. Children learned that meals did not require extravagance. Adults understood how patience, time, and respect for the harvest could transform simple food into sustenance. Pot liquor meals also carried rhythm. They marked seasons when greens were fresh and kitchens where daily effort met familial care. When grandmothers stopped cooking, pot liquor meals faded. Younger generations overlooked the broth, treating greens as a side dish rather than the base of supper. Restaurants rarely featured it because its appeal relied on memory and home skill. Without those who remembered, the meal disappeared quietly. Remembering pot liquor meals matters because it shows how Mississippi kitchens once stretched food, flavor, and love across the table. These suppers taught thrift, patience, and resourcefulness. Losing them meant more than losing a dish. It meant losing a way families nourished one another while honoring the land, the season, and the simple power of home-cooked meals. Night after night, pot liquor carried warmth, sustenance, and tradition until the stove went cold, and with it, a piece of Mississippi history. Biscuits and gravy was a Mississippi supper that turned humble ingredients into nightly comfort. In kitchens without luxury, flour, fat, and milk became the foundation of a meal that fed hungry families with warmth and simplicity. When the skillet came out, everyone knew supper would be ready soon, and no one would go to bed hungry. The biscuits were baked until golden, crisp at the edges, soft inside. The gravy, made from pan drippings, flour, milk, and a touch of salt, was poured generously over them. Sometimes a sprinkle of black pepper or a bit of leftover meat enhanced the flavor, but even plain, the combination was enough to satisfy. Plates were filled quickly, and conversation slowed as everyone ate. This supper mattered because it showed Mississippi families how skill and care could transform basic ingredients into nourishment. Children learned that simplicity could be sustaining. Adults understood how attention, timing, and patience mattered more than abundance. Biscuits and gravy were reliable, predictable, and comforting, a constant at kitchens across the state. When grandmothers stopped cooking, biscuits and gravy shifted. It became more of a breakfast dish or a treat, no longer a full supper that held the table together. Convenience foods and fast meals replaced it. Without the hands and memory of those who knew how to make it properly, the supper quietly disappeared from evening routines. Remembering biscuits and gravy matters because it teaches how Mississippi kitchens once turned modest ingredients into care, connection, and sustenance. This supper fed more than hunger. It fed resilience, tradition, and community. Losing it meant losing lessons in patience, thrift, and quiet devotion, all of which were passed from one generation to the next, plate to plate, until the stove went cold and the ritual ended. These 10 Mississippi suppers may no longer fill tables, but their stories linger in memory. They remind us how grandmothers fed families with care, patience, and ingenuity, turning simple ingredients into meals that nourished both body and heart. Remembering them keeps a piece of Mississippi history alive, one bite, one memory, one kitchen at a time.